In 2019, a single document destroyed $47 billion. Not a market crash, not a fraud investigation, not a surprise bankruptcy filing. A prospectus, a routine document that companies publish before they go public on the stock market. WeWork filed theirs in August of 2019, and within weeks, the company went from the most valuable startup in America to a cautionary tale that business schools will teach for the next 50 years. The valuation collapsed from $47 billion to under $8 billion in a matter of weeks. The IPO was pulled, the CEO resigned, and the question every investor, every journalist, and every analyst asked was the same. How did anyone believe this in the first place? That question is more interesting than it sounds, because the real story of WeWork is not just about a company that overvalued itself. It is about a system, investors, banks, media, and boards that collectively decided to suspend disbelief for years. And it is about one man, with a peculiar kind of charisma, who convinced the smartest money in the world to hand him billions of dollars for a business that was, at its core, renting out desks. Not algorithms, not patents, not proprietary technology. Desks. And yet, for nearly a decade, that was enough. The offices were real. The cold brew coffee was real. The exposed brick walls and the foosball tables and the motivational quotes stenciled in white sans serif on glass partition walls. All of it was real. The revenue was real. The losses, though, were something else entirely. In 2018, WeWork lost $1.9 billion on revenues of $1.8 billion. Read that again. The company spent more money than it brought in, by a margin of over 100%, and it did so while sitting on a valuation that made it worth more than Marriott International, more than Hilton, more than any hotel chain on earth. That is not a startup burning cash to seize a new frontier. That is a company with a structural wound that no amount of funding could close. To understand how the wound opened, you have to go back to a specific morning in 2010. To a building on Grand Street in the Soho neighborhood of Lower Manhattan. The building was mostly empty. The light came through tall industrial windows and fell across raw concrete floors. A 30-year-old Israeli entrepreneur named Adam Neumann stood in that space and made a decision that would eventually reshape how the world thought about the office, and then reshape it again in a much darker direction. He decided he was not going to start a real estate company. He was going to start a revolution. Those are not the same thing. The confusion between the two is how everything begins. Neumann had grown up on a kibbutz in northern Israel, a communal agricultural settlement near the town of Nir Am, where shared living was not a lifestyle brand or a real estate pitch, but a genuine social operating system. You worked the land together, you ate together, you raised children together. Private ownership was secondary to collective purpose. That experience embedded something in him, a genuine, almost evangelical conviction that the way Americans worked, isolated in cubicles under fluorescent lights, separated by hierarchy and silence, was killing something essentially human. He moved to New York City in his mid-20s with roughly $500, a tall frame, wild dark curls, and a relentless physical energy that people who met him almost universally described as magnetic. He tried a baby clothes company that featured built-in knee pads for crawling infants. It failed. He tried eco-friendly flooring. It barely survived. Then in 2010, alongside a quiet, thoughtful architect and designer named Miguel McKelvey, he converted one floor of that Grand Street building into a shared workspace and charged freelancers and small businesses monthly membership fees to use it. They called it WeWork. The name was intentional, not I work, not my work. We. The timing was not accidental, and Neumann understood the market conditions with precision, even if he dressed the opportunity in philosophical language. The financial crisis of 2008 had fractured corporate America at its foundation. Between 2008 and 2010, roughly 8 million jobs were eliminated. Millions of people who had spent their careers inside traditional office structures found themselves suddenly working as freelancers, independent contractors, and founders of tiny startups operating out of spare bedrooms and coffee shops. They needed professional infrastructure, a mailing address that wasn't an apartment, a conference room they could book for a client pitch, a reception desk that made a two-person operation feel, at least briefly, like a real company. WeWork offered all of that, wrapped in an aesthetic that felt like someone had crossed a boutique hotel with a college common room. Fast internet, craft beer on draft in the kitchens, warm Edison bulb lighting instead of fluorescent panels, and most importantly, the sense that you were part of something larger than your own hustle. By 2014, WeWork had expanded to 13 locations across 4 American cities and had raised $90 million in venture funding. By 2015, it had cleared $1 billion in cumulative fundraising and carried a valuation of $10 billion. The growth curve was steep enough to generate its own gravitational field, pulling in capital, press coverage, and talented employees who took below-market salaries in exchange for stock options they believed would one day make them wealthy. Neumann had learned something crucial and somewhat disturbing about how Silicon Valley money functioned in this era. Investors were not simply buying revenue or profit or market share. They were buying narrative. And Neumann was, above almost everything else, a world-class narrative architect. He did not describe WeWork as an office rental company. He described it as a global consciousness, a physical social network, a platform for human elevation. In pitch meetings that investors would later describe with a mixture of awe and embarrassment, he told rooms full of experienced financiers that WeWork would one day be valued, not in the billions, but in the trillions, because it was not competing with Regus or IWG, the actual, established co-working competitors that had existed for decades, but with an entire future in which the concept of the traditional workplace had been permanently disrupted. In one presentation, he listed WeWork's competitors as loneliness and disconnection. Not a company, not a market category, an emotion. That is not a business strategy.
That is a sermon delivered to a congregation that had been primed by a decade of technology wealth to believe that anything could scale, anything could compound, and that the biggest risk was not investing in something that seemed insane. The sermon worked. The key to understanding how it worked at the scale it did lies in one relationship and one 12-minute meeting. In 2017, Masayoshi-san, the founder of SoftBank, the Japanese technology conglomerate that had famously turned $20 million into $14 billion by investing early in Alibaba, met Adam Neumann for the first time. The meeting took place in the back seat of a black car driving around New York City. It lasted 12 minutes. According to multiple accounts published afterward, San pulled out a tablet computer, opened a calculator application, and told Neumann that in a fight, it is the crazy ones who win, not the smart ones, and that Neumann needed to be crazier.
San then committed $4.4 billion to WeWork before the car reached its destination. He later wrote on a napkin in the direct, almost childlike shorthand of a man accustomed to operating at historic scale. Valuation $10 billion, revenues $100 million, employees 2,000. His projected exit, valuation $10 trillion. The gap between those two numbers is not ambition. It is a category error so large it has its own weather system. Between 2017 and 2019, SoftBank's Vision Fund, a $100 billion investment vehicle backed substantially by Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund and the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund, poured more than $10 billion into WeWork. That capital allowed the company to expand operations to 111 cities across 29 countries on 6 continents. It allowed Neumann to sign long-term leases on approximately 47 million square feet of office space worldwide, locking WeWork into contractual obligations that would eventually total $47 billion in future rent payments. The symmetry in those numbers is not poetic coincidence. WeWork's peak valuation and its total lease obligations were almost identical. The company had, in a very literal financial sense, borrowed its own worth in rent. and then asked the market to value it as though that debt didn't exist. This is the point at which the financial architecture starts to look less like a growth stage startup and more like a slowly pressurizing vessel. WeWork's core business model, stripped of the branding and the philosophy and the beer taps, was a classic real estate arbitrage. Lease office space from landlords on long-term contracts, typically 10 to 15 years, at negotiated rates. Subdivide the space. Re-rent it to members on flexible month-to-month or one-year terms at a markup. Collect the spread. The structural flaw in this model is not subtle, and it had already played out in public once before. Regus, the British co-working giant that had operated this exact playbook throughout the 1990s, filed for bankruptcy in 2003 when the dot-com bust caused its members to cancel flexible leases en masse, while its landlord obligations remained completely fixed. WeWork was running the same play, at approximately 10 times the scale, in a market that had been inflated by a decade of near-zero interest rates and venture capital excess. The foundation was familiar. The structure built on top of it was unprecedented in its ambition and its fragility. The S1 prospectus made all of this visible in a way that years of private fundraising rounds had never required. For the first time, independent analysts, people with no personal financial stake in WeWork's narrative, could read the actual numbers without Neumann's voice in the room reframing them. What they found beneath the language of community and consciousness was an accounting metric the company had invented and named Community-Adjusted EBITDA. Standard EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, is already a generous measure. WeWork's version went further, stripping out marketing costs, general and administrative expenses, and what it called pre-opening costs for new locations. When you applied all of those adjustments, WeWork looked profitable. When you used standard accounting, the company was losing nearly $2 for every single dollar it earned. The metric was not illegal, but it was the kind of creative accounting that signals, to anyone who has read enough corporate autopsies, that the people running a company have looked at what the real numbers say and decided to build a different set of numbers that says something else. The prospectus revealed other things. Personal things, governance things, things that in any normal corporate environment would have triggered immediate board intervention and possibly legal review. Neumann had personally borrowed money from WeWork at below-market interest rates, then used those funds to purchase commercial real estate buildings, which he subsequently leased back to WeWork at rates that generated personal profit for himself. He had trademarked the word "we" in his own name, and then charged WeWork nearly $6 million to license it from him, a transaction the board eventually forced him to reverse after it became public. His corporate title had been written into the company charter as permanent. He had granted himself the right to appoint his own successor from beyond whatever professional grave he might eventually occupy. His wife, Rebecca Paltrow Neumann, a first cousin of the actress Gwyneth Paltrow, held a formal veto over that succession process. His children had received share allocations written into founding documents in a structure that corporate governance scholars described as without precedent. And between 2017 and 2019, while WeWork was burning through billions of dollars of investor capital and paying its employees in stock options it told them would be worth a fortune, Neumann personally sold approximately $430 million of his own shares in secondary transactions, converting paper wealth into liquid cash before the company ever reached public markets. The institutional investor community responded to the prospectus with a speed and unanimity that suggested the document had not created new concerns so much as confirmed ones that had been quietly circulating for months. Large funds that had indicated interest in the IPO began formally withdrawing. Fidelity, T. Rowe Price, and other major asset managers who would have been natural anchor investors went silent. Scott Galloway, the NYU Stern marketing professor who had built a public profile by delivering precise, unsentimental judgments about technology companies, published an analysis calling WeWork the most overvalued company in the history of modern markets, and predicted plainly that the IPO would not close. His piece circulated through institutional finance within hours. He was right. By September 30th, 2019, WeWork officially postponed the IPO indefinitely. By the third week of October, under pressure from SoftBank and from the board members who had watched the company's implied valuation crater in real time, Adam Neumann resigned as CEO. SoftBank moved in with a rescue financing package that valued WeWork at $8 billion, $39 billion less than the peak valuation, achieved in under 90 days. The terms of Neumann's exit package produced a particular kind of public fury. SoftBank paid him approximately $1.7 billion to leave, a figure assembled from share buybacks valued at close to $1 billion, a consulting agreement worth $185 million, and the forgiveness of a $430 million personal loan he had taken from a SoftBank-affiliated lender. The employees who had accepted stock options in lieu of higher salaries, who had worked long hours in the belief that WeWork's public offering would reward their faith financially, received options that were now worth effectively nothing. Approximately 2,000 of them were laid off in the restructuring that followed. The man who had built the company on the language of community walked away with nearly $2 billion. The community absorbed the cost. The bankruptcy eventually came anyway, because the financial structure made it almost inevitable. In November of 2023, 4 years after the failed IPO and 13 years after that first floor on Grand Street, WeWork filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in a federal court in New Jersey. The company listed total liabilities of $18.6 billion. It began the process of rejecting hundreds of commercial leases in cities across North America, Europe, and Asia. The same leases that had been celebrated as territorial conquest during the expansion years. The physical infrastructure of the revolution, the whiteboard walls and the phone booths and the nap pods and the stenciled quotes about making a life, not just a living, was methodically stripped from buildings and returned to landlords. The beer taps were removed. The branded mugs were packed into boxes. But here is the thing that nearly every post-mortem gets wrong by focusing on the drama of Neumann's personality and the spectacle of the collapse. WeWork was not a fraud in the legal sense of that word. The spaces existed. The members existed. Hundreds of thousands of legitimate small businesses, freelancers, and enterprise clients used WeWork offices every single day and received real value for their membership fees. The revenue was real. The problem was not that anyone fabricated numbers. The problem was that an entire financial ecosystem spanning Tokyo and Riyadh and San Francisco and New York collectively decided to assign WeWork a category it did not belong to. By calling it a technology company rather than a real estate company, investors could apply a technology valuation multiple, the kind justified by software that scales infinitely with near zero marginal cost. Real estate does not work that way. Every new WeWork location required a new lease negotiation, new construction costs typically running between $300 and $500 per square foot, new staff, new member acquisition spending. The marginal cost of growth never collapsed. The unit economics never reached an inflection point. The model was always, structurally, what Regus had been in 1999. A real estate arbitrage business dressed in the language of the era's dominant wealth creation story. The moment the prospectus forced the public market to look directly at what WeWork actually was, to read the lease obligations, the adjusted metrics, the governance structure, the related party transactions, the story ended. Not because anything changed inside the buildings. The offices were the same. The members were the same. The furniture was the same. What changed was the shared fiction, and when the fiction dissolved, $47 billion did not go anywhere discoverable. It did not transfer to a winner. It did not fund a fraud that enriched a few at the expense of many. It simply ceased to exist because it had never existed as anything other than a number that a sufficient number of powerful people had agreed to say out loud. The moment they stopped saying it, the number was gone. Every era produces a version of this.
A company emerges with a story so perfectly calibrated to the fears and desires of its moment that the market prices in a future that capital alone cannot manufacture. The names rotate, the industries rotate, The specific mechanisms shift with technology and regulation and fashion. The underlying math, though, is always the same equation. If you are spending more than you earn, at scale, with no demonstrated path to an inflection point where that reverses, the only remaining variable is not whether it ends. It is how many people are still in the room when the lights come on. If this kind of forensic business history is what you're here for, subscribe. There's more where this came from.